What's up, everybody? Today's video is a little bit different because we're not going to be fixing shit. But I want to go over something with you because this came up, it happened to me, and hopefully from watching this you guys can learn a thing or two or three. Okay, so had a car come in, 2001 Chevy Impala, and the complaint was an intermittent loss of cruise control, the overhead driver's information center, and the blower motor. So the person would drive the car and intermittently those three things would just quit working altogether. Now, I road tested this thing trying to duplicate this problem numerous times. I probably put 40 miles on the car and I could not get it to happen. So I could ride with the scan tool on it, nothing would happen. I could ride with, testing different things with a multimeter, nothing would happen. So my hands were kind of tied here in this case because I didn't really have much to go on because I can't duplicate the problem. This kind of thing happens a lot because, a motherfucker will drive the car half hour to and half hour from work every day, so you figure about 5 hours a week, and maybe once or twice a month something like this will happen. You know what I'm saying? So they bring the car to me and I get a small window of time to try to figure out what's going on with it. Well, if they can't get it to happen consistently, there's not much I can do to get stuff like this to happen, consistently. So when it comes to cases like this is where reading and understanding wiring diagram and how things are kind of wired together, can really pay off. So I had this car come in, took it for a ride, couldn't get anything to happen to it. Hands are kind of tied, but at the same time, the person wants the car fixed. You can live without the driver's information center. You can kind of live without cruise control, but you really can't live without the blower motor, especially when it's going to get cold as tits out here soon. So it was kind of important to them that the car got fixed. But again, I get a small window of time to look into it. So usually what I'll do in cases like this is try to see what these things that aren't working have in common. And usually that breaks down into one of two things. They either share a power circuit or a ground circuit. So I dug up the OEM diagrams for the power feed and the ground feed for those components. So I don't know if you guys can see that good or not. All these individual components can be traced basically to this one grounding point. This is called G201, which in the case of this Impala, number 7 is G201. This is like right here. So up behind the ignition switch is this ground cable. I used this first because this was the ground for the HVAC control module. And when I'm looking through all this other stuff that's on this ground circuit, everything else wasn't reported as not working. The radio never cut off. The cluster never cut off. Turn signal still worked. Other things we have here, steering wheel controls, it didn't even have them, so that didn't really matter. Nothing else on this, ground circuit was reported as being a failure. So I dug up the information on the power side of those components. And what we have here, we have the cruise control module, we have the HVAC module, we have the driver's information center. It's also on here. You can actually trace this too down onto this diagram, which shows the remote compass sensor, and I think there's a temperature sensor on here too somewhere. Yeah, ambient air temp sensor, which were reported not working. So in this case what we had was, we've got, here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 of the different things that were reported as not working, and they all have something in common. What they had in common was the circuit number 300. So you guys can get a look at that. This one right here, the circuit number 300. And this comes off of the ignition switch in the on position. It goes up into the junction block. That thing had like a fuse box on each end of the dash. Went through one of them, and then it powered all those different components. And you can see when the ignition switch is on, one set of contacts will power some stuff, and another set of contacts will power some other stuff. So in this case, one of the outputs from the ignition switch is suspected of not getting power. But I have no way of knowing for sure what was actually wrong. You know, it's not like you can just go and then just take the ignition switch apart to find the failure. That's really not an option. In some cases, well, especially in the case of this Impala, I did eventually take the ignition switch apart and it dropped all its guts out of it, so that's not really something that you can just, you know, go out and do. But it was a big help to find a commonality between all of these components that intermittently would not work. If you guys have been watching my stuff, you know I am totally against just replacing parts without cause. But this is one of the cases where, you know, we see a commonality, we cannot duplicate the problem, and we kind of just got to roll the dice, you know. And I explained it to the person. I said, look, you know, I can't guarantee that this is it, but, you know, this is probably our best first step. We could have had other issues in here. We could have had, you know, a problem with the wiring from the ignition switch down to this junction block. But again, I could hook my meter up to this and see if we ever lose power on this while we're driving, and, you know, see if it loses power when it cuts out. But this problem I could not duplicate. I mean, I don't know how far, you know, you're expected to go. I mean, if you drive the car for 40 miles and it doesn't do it, you know, at what point do you say, hey, you can either replace something or you can just live with the problem, you know? Well, every problem has a cause. You know, there is no, you know, mystery electrical gremlins coming out, Gizmo running up in this motherfucker causing havoc. That shit's just not going to happen. Instead, it was just, look, what I want to do, the car had, I think it's had like 140,000 miles on it or so. I said, look, let's just replace the ignition switch here, and we're just going to hope for the best, you know, because of time, you know. I guess if I were to drive the car, you know, 30 minutes each way to work every day, and, you know, have all the test equipment hooked up and actually catch it and actually have it happen, you know, that would have been one thing. Because if, let's just say, I did have, you know, I was back probing this connector on this junction block, and I'm sitting there riding down the road and I got 14 volts or whatever, and then I just lost it, you know, then I could say, well, hey, you know, chances are I probably lost it because of, you know, problem with the ignition switch. But I went ahead and I rolled the dice, you know, and it's just one of those deals where, you know, like I said, people want the car fixed, they want answers from you, and, you know, sometimes you just don't have them. You can't get the evidence that you need. So I went ahead and replaced the ignition switch in this car. Now, I had no interest in filming this repair because, number one, it was a gamble. I couldn't prove that this needed to be replaced. I don't really like doing stuff like that. And number two was because of the pass lock sensor that sits up in this ignition switch housing. You know, I kind of got to make the call of, you know, what's do it yourself and what's not. I know very well that if I were to fuck this sensor up, taking it out of this switch, the car would be undrivable, you know. And, you know, that's just one of those things where it's just like, I don't know if I want to show that. I don't know if I want to give people the false hope that they can go and replace this switch, wham bam, because if you get a little fucking carried away with this little pass lock sensor in here, like I said, you're going to be in a world of fuck, you know what I mean? But, you know, forget about all that right now. I went ahead and replaced the switch. I kept in contact with the person. They said the car, beautiful, hasn't messed up. It's probably been 3.5 weeks now since I did this. No reports of a failure. As far as they're considered, you know, the car's fixed. But I had to get into it a little bit more than that. So what I did, I pulled this ignition switch apart. And when I did, it kind of like dumped its guts out. There was a whole bunch of these pins and springs that came out, and the springs just they took off everywhere, so they're gone. And to be honest, I don't know if I'd ever be able to get this thing back together. So I got the switch apart, and it's kind of like it's different than what I'm used to seeing on Chevys, but that's the way it is. It's got this little I don't know, we'll make up a word for this. We'll call it the flappadoodle. It's got all these little pins and springs in here, and I guess this thing has like kind of almost like a little, I don't know if I want to call it a cam in it, but something similar to that. So let's just say it's sitting in the car like this. You put the key in, you can turn it to crank and it kicks back. That's what this little spring's for. It's not really working right now because it's all apart, but I think you get the gist of it. That's off. You know, you can take the key out, put it back in, accessory on, start. You know, pretty cool. I'm assuming that as that piece rotates, it pushes down on these little pins right here, like this guy. See, he's on a spring. I press him down, he pops back up. There was a spring there, spring there, spring there, spring there, and all these corresponding pins. What was that guy? But this is where it gets interesting. When I took these apart, what I found inside the switch was a bunch of shit. So if you can imagine this all assembled, and these things will make or break contact depending on those little pins where they're pushed up at. There's going to be a connection made in between like this metal square and the corresponding square here. This big shaft right here is the main power feed. So if you're looking at the diagram, that shaft is basically the power feed, and depending on the switch position, power gets put to each of these output pins. So there's your one in, your big one, and there's your three little squares. I don't know if you guys can see that. You see all that shit build up on that square? How this one's like kind of shiny silvery, kind of black, dark gray, shiny, shiny, black. Well, it's also got the same kind of shit build up on this this piece right here. So it's got, you know, your shiny square, all fucked up square. I didn't try to scrape that off. I'm not sure if it even would scrape off, but I was at the point where, you know, the switch is already in. I don't have to try to clean this up and see if it works. So what's happening is that there's a big time connection problem inside the switch, where you've got two contact points that are supposed to touch each other and everything be pretty, and they're not. They're kind of fucked up. So I took one end of my meter and just touched this terminal, and then touched the corresponding pin, I don't remember which one it was, for continuity, and it did. And it turns out that that corresponding pin on the switch was this circuit number 300, which put power to the things that were reporting cutting out, like the HVAC controller, which put power to the blower motor, the driver's information center, and the cruise control switch. So, you know, the person can say, hey, you know, it all works and that's awesome. You know what I mean? I couldn't drive the car enough to verify the repair because I couldn't even get it to fuck up in the first place. But after taking it apart and seeing this and the corresponding grit build up on that other piece, you know, I was pretty satisfied that the repair was a success. And like I said, you know, 3.5 weeks later, there hasn't been a problem. So I'm pretty cool with that. I can't even scrape it off. I'm trying right now. But anyway, like I said, you know, sometimes people's expectations of what they want from you are kind of unrealistic, especially in cases where, you know, you can't duplicate the problem, you can't collect good hard evidence, you know, of a failed component, you know. And I'm the last person that will throw parts at something. I mean, you see all the trouble I went through for, you know, replacing a $26 cam sensor. You know what I mean? Even though I got a lot of shit for that, but fuck it. You know, I always like to see good hard evidence before I replace something. But, you know, in this case, like I said, these little fucking springs right here, I don't know if you can see this. This little tiny spring, yeah, there was like 5 of them. You saw the thing propel right there. As soon as I took the switch apart, 3 of them were like ba-doom, ba-doom, ba-doom. You know what I mean? Now you've got at least one reported case where the ignition switch contacts inside were bad and caused a couple of components not to work anymore. So what I was saying earlier was, you know, people's expectations, you know, they bring the car to you and it's something that doesn't happen a lot, and, you know, what do? Do you drive the car for 8 hours? If you drive the car for 8 hours, do you charge, you know, 8 hours of labor for driving around? I mean, if a shop did that and they're $100 an hour, are they really going to charge $800, you know, for trying to figure out what's wrong with the car because they can't duplicate it? You know, I think that's where a lot of the guesswork comes in, where it's just like, you know, we're on a time constraint here. We have to just fix the car. We have to do something, you know, which leads to a lot of things being guessed, you know. But at least in my experience, what I've seen other fucking technicians do is you know, they'll make a guess, but they won't do something like read over this. You know what I mean? Because to them, this is like looking at a vagina for the first time. They don't know what the fuck they're doing. You know what I mean? Yeah, it's one of those things that I really don't like doing. I don't like throwing parts at something. You know, but at the same time, I gotta make it happen. You know? There is something else I want to say. Well, I've already, you know, spoken on the side of like the person that's doing the repair, but I want to say something too about the person on the other side of the repair, and that's the customer. You know, the person here, pretty smart, was able to try to document as much stuff as possible as far as, you know, what else happens. You know, something like the blower motor not working is kind of obvious because, you know, you're riding down the road and air stops blowing out of the vents. But at the same time, this person was very observant and noticed that the little information center, you know, up on the headliner didn't work at the same time, and also noticed that cruise control didn't work at the same time. And that helped make my job just a little bit easier, you know. So anyway, in summary, intermittent problems. They suck. I hate them. Hope they die. They die and go to hell, motherfuckers. You know, I didn't want to make a video and say how to fix your blower fan. You know, not test nothing, just go and replace a fucking ignition switch and just say, so if your blower fan's not working, now you know how to fix it yourself, because that's just fucking retarded. It's easy to give a very vague title to a video just to get views, not have any real, you know, good information, more like comedy relief, you know what I mean? So anyway, thanks for watching, and we're going to end this with the Valentine wearing a hat.